experiences in some of these related conversations. But I want to spend a few minutes giving you a little bit of history on when Black Lives Matter started, what are the different, what is it, and what is the movement for Black lives, and how are they different, to really like start our conversation. So first, we will go back to 2013, and I'm going to mention a few events that happened, which as I talk about them, you're probably going to think, oh yeah, I remember that, and maybe saw the story arc at the time, or maybe not. So Black Lives Matter is a non-centralized grassroots social justice movement. It's organized by regional chapters. Now that could mean a state chapter, it could mean a city chapter. In New York City, and I'll talk about a little bit more, there are different neighborhoods that have multiple chapters. And so I want to mention that because it's not like the federation system where we have Eastern Connecticut and Stamford and Hartford Federation, and they're all part of one system and they all represent different areas. This is much more loosely autonomous and not quite, and for sure not centralized. So the movement started, and it really started with a hashtag, right? A Twitter hashtag that was hashtag Black Lives Matter. It started after in 2013, following George Zimmerman's acquittal for the death of Trayvon Martin in Florida. And as details of the shooting unfolded, two social justice leaders, both women, both Black, both queer identifying or LGBTQ, Alicia Garza and Patrisse Cullors, who are in the Bay Area, created this hashtag in response to Martin's death. And it spread like wildfire and really has created the talking point, right, around this millennial kind of based, but like this new civil rights movement, right? To say Black Lives Matter doesn't mean, and just to like, doesn't mean that other lives don't matter, right? It means that Black lives matter too, right? And that's really their premise in saying this. And the reason they started the movement was because they're saying, we have organizations within our community that represent Black people, but are they really representing us as intersectional, feminist, queer, Black women? And so part of their entire kind of push for the Black Lives Matter movement has really been to push voices to the front for those who have not always, to be very inclusive, and for those that have not always been part of it. I mention that just because it's important to their founding story and how they relate kind of in an intersectional way. So each local Black Lives Matter chapter is different. An example that I've been using the past week or so is last week there was a protest or a rally in Queens, New York, and it was in a park, and there were two Black Lives Matter chapters that basically represented the same area having conflicting rallies in the same park, because one was more intersectional and pushing a slightly different agenda than the other one. I mention that because I think it shows that when we talk about Black Lives Matter, we're really much more talking about an idea and less an organization, because there's really an anything goes when it comes to the organizational piece. So each local Black Lives Matter chapter uses different tactics. So some prefer traditional protest methods, right? We've seen a lot of marching in the streets the past few weeks. Others prefer direct actions. Some have had die-ins outside of police departments or sheriff's office, or lying down in public highways. And there's a difference of views on a lot of things. And we saw part of this over the last few weeks, where we've seen a group called Campaign Zero, which is based in Baltimore, where the leader of that group actually ran for mayor. And they're very much part of, like, they want to be part of the process, part of the political system. And so the tactics they use are much more related to that. So after, in the last few weeks after George Floyd's murder, they came up with kind of an 8-step approach to what they want to see in terms of criminal justice reform. And so others have kind of adapted that, but that's been kind of that group's like operating principles all along, is that they are very solution-based, where you have some of the other chapters that really are just trying to drive attention to the issue. And so Campaign Zero has, they've pushed for police and changes. Some of those are reflected in the House bill that was pushed out over the last couple of weeks. And they're looking for things that are doable, or things that they could get bipartisan support. And there are other but Black Lives Matter groups that they're saying defund the police. And we're gonna get to what that means in a second. But right, so there are very different pieces. Now, one of the questions that's come up a lot over the last few weeks is Black Lives Matter has kind of had a resurgence after the murder of George Floyd, and after really people have taken to the streets, is what's the deal with Black Lives Matter in Israel? Because a lot of people remembered that several years ago there was an issue. And so I want to go over what happened. So in August of 2016, the movement for Black Lives, right, not Black Lives Matter, the movement for Black Lives, released a national platform claiming that they represented 50 organizations. 29 identified as a united front, which are Black Lives Matter chapters. And it includes some of these chapters. It also includes groups like the NAACP and the Urban League. And what we found out after the time, and I'm mentioning this before, and then I'll go into what the problematic pieces are, is that different organizations worked on different pieces of the platform. So it wasn't, and now we're getting closer to the Democratic and Republican national conventions, and having some experience in that space, right? When they do these platform meetings, you know, the DNC meeting you can watch on C-SPAN, and it's a very public process, and everyone's debating the entire language that goes into it. That's not quite what happened with this Movement for Black Lives platform. It basically was groups giving them, you know, here's 2 pages on this, here's 2 pages on this, here's 2 pages on this, which frankly is like how not to write a platform and get buy-in, but that's what they did. So the majority of things in it were related to, it was divided into 6 categories, mostly related to criminal justice reform and economic policies and racial equity. But there was also a portion about called Invest Divest, related to American military aid to Israel. And so the platform, and now what sits on the Movement for Black Lives website, is a little bit different than what sat there in 2016 when this was passed. But right now there's a link that you can click to from the Invest Divest page. It has information on problematic, or what they're saying is problematic policies related to several countries. One of them, and it's a couple of paragraphs, the language focuses on ending military aid to Israel. It's talking points that we've seen many times before related, that come from the BDS movement, and talk about how United States military aid makes the United States complicit. Usually they say complicit in the occupation or abuses by the Israeli government. And we've seen actually over the last couple of years some municipal city council level BDS campaigns that have used very similar language. There's also language in there, and some of the more problematic text came in the original platform, where they talked about that Israel is an apartheid state, and that what Israel has done to Palestinians is a genocide. At the time, in 2016, the Israel Action Network and JFNA and Jewish Council of Public Affairs and federations and JCRCs condemned the language, and ADL, and basically the entire alphabet soup of Jewish organizations condemned the language, and especially the apartheid and genocide terminology, saying it was grossly inappropriate and completely false, right? And so I want to name that. And then say that one of the things we also noticed in 2016 in looking through this platform and in the process that happened right after, right when we saw this language erupt, is that a few people read the platform, saw the language, it became a national story in Jewish papers very quickly. It circled around the Jewish community, but most of our federations and JCRCs, when they called their local NAACP chapters or other Black leaders in their community to say, even Black Lives Matter chapters, what's the deal with this platform? Why are you calling out Israel? Clearly, like, there's no genocide. The Palestinian population has increased, right? And all these pieces, most of the people they called had no idea what we were even talking about. And so I mentioned that for two reasons. One, it makes us think about what is the leadership structure, right, of the movement for Black lives. But it also, we as a Jewish community, we're putting a lot more attention into the few sentences in that platform than the entire rest of the platform got. And so it's an interesting thing right now. I saw an article earlier today where a couple of people who had made comments then and said, red line, we're not working with Black Lives Matter, we're not working with Black Lives Matter ever again because of this platform. Now we're saying we need to be in and involved in this process. And so that was kind of what happened in 2016. And it's kind of playing out again in certain circles. A lot of the articles calling attention to this are recycled from that particular time. There are not a lot of new articles about that issue. But a few other things I want to go over about how Israel is intertwined. In 2014, again, another event that most people remember, Michael Brown was shot by police officer Darren Wilson in Ferguson, Missouri. And I remember I remember it exactly, and remembering a lot of the scenes that came out of that moment. And a lot of what we saw on television was fairly violent. We saw tear gas and very difficult situations between protesters and police. And at the same time, Israel was in the middle of Operation Protective Edge in Gaza. And as protesters in Ferguson were talking about being tear gassed by police on Twitter and other social media outlets, the Palestinians in Gaza started a hashtag from Ferguson to Palestine and from Palestine to Ferguson, giving them advice on how to deal with tear gas. And so what happened from that was a connection between some Black and Palestinian activists who were dealing with similar issues at the time and pulled that together for a reason why intersectionally they should be aligned. So there is a group called Black for Palestine that kind of originated then. In 2015, they organized a Black solidarity statement with Palestine endorsing the BDS movement. And it includes one of the signers to that was Patrisse Cullors, who's one of the leaders was one of the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement. So what we're hearing now is that Black Lives Matter is very tied to BDS, very tied. We've seen on some college campuses as BDS votes have taken place that there have been intersectional relationships between Students for Justice in Palestine and some Black Lives Matter chapters. It's not in every campus, but it is something that exists. And so what do we do, right? What do we do right now where we know this information? And at the same time, we as Jews have a commitment to social justice, to racial justice, and many of our younger generation are marching in the street side by side. Many of us on this call may have marched in the street or want to take action on this. And so one of the things that we're encouraging, and I should say that one thing we learned in 2016 was that we weren't at the table. For a really long time in the Jewish community, we've been telling stories about how Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel marched hand in hand with Martin Luther King. And we've been telling those stories and we've been using that image to talk about Jewish and Black relationships. The problem is that was in the 1960s. We're in a very different time right now. And the reality is, as Jewish communities moved out of cities and the Jewish and Black neighborhoods were less integrated, we lost a lot of those relationships. And so, and as someone who didn't live through the civil rights movement, right? I guess you could say I'm living through the civil rights movement of our day. But for me, it's always seemed like, okay, but what are we doing now? Right? And a lot of what we see in terms of Black Lives Matter or some activists, and I would say some activists because it is not a national effort to align with the BDS movement, is that we see some activists aligning with the BDS movement because they feel a camaraderie and because the Palestinian groups have shown up for them. And we don't always show up for others. And one of the things we do a lot with our JCRCs, and many of our communities have, is build those bridges. And we do that through different things, right? Some federations have social justice or social action days on Martin Luther King Day, working together hand in hand. Some have educational programs, and there are a variety of different ways to engage. But the reality is, in 2016, even the Jewish organizations that are most engaged in this racial justice space said we didn't have the relationships. We weren't at the table because we didn't have the relationships with the younger members of the movement and the people who are leading now. You know, we have great relationships with NAACP, we have great relationships with Urban League, but we also need to make sure that we're developing, and sometimes it's hard because sometimes it's Jewish organizations, we don't have relationships with certain Jewish groups within our own community. But if we want to have a voice, then we need to also be there. And so I think what we are realizing right now in 2020, amidst all this unrest in our country, is that we want to be at the table now. And we're not going to use the Movement for Black Lives Matter platform to fully pull ourselves away and say we're not going to engage in this really important moment right now for racial justice and racial equity, and that we need to also deal with some racism within our own communities. We need to deal with the diversity of our communities, Jewish communities, right? And think about the messages that we're sending to others. And so I wanted to really today just kind of give you a little background on why people are talking about Black Lives Matter and BDS in the same sentence, and then open up for questions and talk a little bit about kind of how we move forward from here. So we can open up if there are any questions.
Thank you, Stephanie. If you know how to use the chat function, hit participants and hit the blue hand if you have a question. If you can't figure out how to do that, you can chat me up on the side, or you can raise your hand.
Hello?
Hi, Ken.
Hi. I understand what you're saying, Stephanie, but I remember back in the 60s when we as Jews spent a lot of time supporting the Blacks in their civil rights efforts, and Martin Luther King and the other marchers, Schwarmer, death. And as my impression is, and you'll correct me here, I'm sure, my impression is those movements were more successful as some improvement occurred in the Black communities and so forth. There was a movement against the Jewish people by the Blacks. I remember them talking about how we were taking their jobs, that the Black people couldn't get employment because the Jews were taking their jobs. And looking back in Jewish history, Jews have always been very socially conscious and concerned about the rights of other people. And I get the feeling over our history, even in Germany and elsewhere, we've been used to get other people's rights. And then when they no longer need us, they turn on us. And that's my concern. I have no problem with defending Blacks against police brutality and deaths and all that kind of stuff. I think that's all very appropriate. I'm just very troubled by what I see as Jewish history over generations. And I'd love to hear how you respond to that.
So I actually want to touch on a couple of things that you mentioned, and one is kind of this place where a couple of months ago, and I think there are actually a couple of you might have been on the call. We did a regional call that Hartford Federation sponsored about the coronavirus and anti-Semitism. And we talked about how, every time that there's an opportunity, I don't think opportunity is the right word, but every time there's a world event and it comes time to blame someone, the Jewish community ends up in the mix, right? And so what we've also heard over the last few weeks is, and this has kind of muted itself once it was proven to not be true, is claims that the police officers in Minneapolis were trained by the IDF and by the Israeli police on techniques to use against for police brutality, right? It's been completely disproven. No one, the Minneapolis Police Department participated in a training. There are some police trainings. None of them are tactical, but the point is that there always ends up being, so I totally see your point in saying, like, as a Jewish community, sometimes we're fighting for other people, but where do we end up in that conversation? And I think that's a very valid point, because I do think we often end up there. But I think, one of the things we see right now is that we have faced over the last, few years, a rise in anti-Semitism here in the United States. And one of the things, and it's a picture that that I know took place at federations across the country, was after the shooting in Pittsburgh. We were joined by our neighbors, our friends in Jewish organizations, Christian organizations, local NAACPs, local community leaders, and we weren't standing alone, right? And that, I think, is a difference in Jewish history, is that for a time, and we've felt very safe in America, at least in for sure in the recent memory, was that we weren't standing alone. And so I think now is the time where we say, we weren't standing alone, you were there for us, we're gonna make sure that we're there for you. Because also this is also about civil rights, and it's about change, and it's about things that the Confederacy was challenged to Jewish communities too. And so thinking about that, and I know there were Jewish leaders in the Confederacy also, right? We have a very complicated history with that. But I think now's the time to really say, these issues are important. They're issues that are important as Americans, and we need to listen. And also I think, and I'm gonna name that, in many of our community spaces, right, we know that there are Jews of color. We know that there are Black Jews, but how often do we see them represented in our spaces, right? And thinking about, even in this moment, how can we work from the inside about our community, and how do we talk about racism, and how do we talk about these issues, and how do we prepare our teens and college students for them, as we also talk about fighting anti-Semitism and fighting racism at the same time, are things that I think we can uplift now. So I'm looking at some of the questions.
Stephanie, we've got a question from the floor first. Sheila actually had her hand up.
Okay, go. Sheila,
yes. Hi, Stephanie. It's nice to hear from you. So a couple of things. I'm really heartened by the many Jewish organizations that are coming out in terrific support. And they're not maybe mentioning the words Black Lives Matter, but certainly for racial justice, whether it's the Workmen's Circle, now the Workers' Circle, whether it's the Anti-Defamation League, my Jewish Democratic group that I belong to. Almost every group I belong to has been outspoken. Hadassah, which of course I belong to, has always come out for this and is speaking out now. So I think we need to get it on a local level here, and I'm going to make a pitch for tomorrow night. Karen knows about this. We need to find out in our own...
Listen to me for one. We have a slew of questions. Please be respectful. We've got a slew of questions. You've got a question for Stephanie?
Yeah, well, yes. The question is, one of the things that Karen and I talked about in preparation for our discussion with the president of the local NAACP was that their charter also, or their platform at some point, had a BDS component in it. Do you know about that, Stephanie? Because I did question this woman, and she is going to look into it. I asked her if that was part of the NAACP platform in any way. Do you know about that?
Great.
Yeah, it's not. It's not.
Is that the whole
It's
answer?
not. It's not. The only thing I could think, because I actually recently looked through all of their legislative priorities, the NAACP, and BDS for sure is not part of it. The only issue, and this could be what someone was talking about, is they do support the right to boycott. I don't think that they've come out, actually I'm pretty positive that they have not come out against anti-BDS legislation, but someone's interpretation could be that because they support the right to boycott, that's the position. But they are not engaged in BDS activity. They have never been, I'm actually a member of the NAACP. They're not engaged in that activity.
Thank you. Stephanie from the chat room, I'm wondering how the potential annexation of the West Bank will play out when we look at intersectionality issues. Would love your thoughts.
Yeah, so I hope many of you were on our call yesterday that JFNA hosted with former Ambassador Dan Shapiro. If not, Karen will send the link out to all of you. And also with the Mayor of Efrat, Oded Ravivi, and Dr. Shira Efron. And they were talking about annexation or the application of sovereignty. And we've been trying to use both words. I think they're being used somewhat interchangeably, but we do understand they have loaded meaning to many. And so absolutely, I think one of the things that we heard yesterday from the mayor of Efrat is that the timetable on this was really set up by the Trump peace plan. And so that they can start moving forward. And so right now, it was something that I don't think many people were thinking about, but basically, and just to give everyone a refresher, the idea is that the Israeli government, as soon as July 1st, may annex parts of the West Bank. So there are different discussions. We still don't actually know which parts they're going to be annexing. Right now, it seems like it's going to be a small amount, whether that is just something like Malay Adumim, which is right outside Jerusalem, whether it also includes the Gush Etzion block, right? Two different areas that are in every peace agreement have always been considered that they will be part of Israel for land swaps, or if it goes broader than that. And so there are a lot of American Jewish organizations that are speaking out against this move, saying it endangers a two-state solution. I think we at JFNA are not taking a stance on this issue. We had calls with lots of perspectives, but it for sure is going to all these things happening at one time: the coronavirus, annexation, Black Lives Matter. It's just like one thing after another. I mean, I've had a very busy month, but it also means that for activists who are trying to engage on one particular issue, they're going to use this as an effort to kind of bring them all to the forefront. And so an example is there was a flyer going around the internet yesterday or over the weekend about a Black Lives Matter protest at Gracie Mansion, which is where Mayor of New York City lives. And there have been daily protests outside Gracie Mansion, but this particular one was sponsored by Muslims for Black Lives Matter or some group, and it said, no police, no Zionists, welcome. I mean, there was a lot of back and forth in different kind of Facebook groups and different places, and even from some Palestinians saying, don't equate my issue with yours, right? This is a moment for to talk about the experience of Black people in America. It's not a moment to talk about the experience of Palestinians living in Gaza. because these are two distinct situations, and one should not conflate with the other because it weakens both cases. And even some across the kind of stream, people have mentioned that particular fact. But we are in a process where in a few weeks, we will start seeing the Democratic Party platform. We know that they're start to take shape. We've already had several state Democratic Party conventions where there have been BDS resolutions. One in Arizona, actually, a few weeks ago, where they looked at this annexation issue. Some, we had issues in North Carolina where they were looking at other pieces of the issue. And so we very possibly will see a lot of this play out in progressive circles, because we don't know what we're doing right now to kind of get ready is working on the messaging points around each particular issue to try to give everyone the background they need. So we have another kind of like 2-pager on annexation and application of sovereignty that we sent out to all the federations. And what we're going to start doing is thinking about, as over the next week and a half, it becomes clearer, maybe, what the Israeli government is going to do, is thinking about it also through that intersectional lens. And we're monitoring Facebook and social media activity to, try to hear the chatter so that we can be prepared for, where these intersectional spaces are going to come up.
Thank you. Again, if you have a question, you use the chat section, and you can either write your question in the chat or use the raise hand function, and a little blue hand will come up. This is coming from Mark. I'm going to paraphrase a little bit. Please provide a few practical suggestions what you would do if you lived in cities like Raleigh. I'm assuming the South and like Raleigh.
So I think I'm gonna go a few miles over to Durham, and think about this as if I was in Durham, and I'll name why in a second. Well, I can name why for now. It's because we've had some issues in the Durham City Council, right? And there was an issue a few years ago about some of these police programs that I mentioned before, police training programs with Israel and the United States, and it was led by Jewish Voice for Peace and other activists. And one of the things, again, that we realized, I think, in that process, and Karen was still in North Carolina then, and kind of hearing about it from close by, was who are we picking up the phone to call, right? Like, if this is going to be a big conversation, and the segments of the Jewish community, right, Jewish Voice for Peace, which is an anti-Zionist small fringe group in the community, is going to activate people for this, then where are our relationships, and why aren't we the ones that are being able to call leaders in the Black community and have the difficult conversations with them and talk to them about what's going on? And they've done a really good job in Durham, for example, really spending some serious time over the past couple of years since that moment in building relationships with local leaders, local civic groups and chambers of commerce, and through different ways as a way of reaching out to the broader and what is a very diverse community. And so I would say, if you live in cities like Raleigh, but I actually think it's if you live anywhere, so Raleigh or Durham, is that we need to start building relationships, right? And some of us have them. Some of us have them wearing, Sheila, I think, was talking before about the many hats that she wears in the community, right? Some of us wear a lot of hats, and Jewish Federation is not the only hat we wear. And thinking about over the course, it could be PTA, it could be a senior group, but who are we talking to? And how do we start bridging these conversations? Last summer, I was involved in an organization. It was young people. And I was having this conversation with someone there, and she was a Black woman from Wisconsin. And somehow, not that I like purposely try to have conversations about Israel with everyone I talk to. Okay, I kind of do, but somehow, like, Israel came up in conversation. And she said, well, I identify more with the Palestinian cause because Israel is doing X, Y, and Z. And I said, oh, like, what do you mean? And we started having a conversation and a back and forth. And she said, I never knew any of that, right? Like, this is just what I've been exposed to. And I think part of the problem is that we opt out and we say, like, we're not going to get engaged in this space, we leave room for others to engage in these spaces that are not going to have the same conversations, right? And so whether that's parts of the Jewish community that are not Zionist or pro-Israel, or whether that's also the Jews are just not being represented or at the table. We had similar issues with the Women's March, right? We felt we needed to have conversations about the anti-Semitism surrounding the Women's March because we needed to speak up, right? We can't always just take ourselves out. We need to actually try to make the change from within.
Okay, thank you. This is coming from Brenda, and I'm trying to unmute you, Brenda. There you go.
Here, I'm
It
unmuted.
says, the us and them dialogue continues when we do not listen carefully and share our human story. She's a member of B'nai Shalom in Putnam and Willimantic Wyndham, sorry, I'm getting cut off, NAACP. What's your follow-up question from that, please?
My question is, I have a real problem when this becomes political to a point we don't talk about our essence as Jews. We don't talk about our experiences that lead us to social justice and the desire to see people holistically. This us and them is dangerous territory. We experienced it with fascism in many, many different countries. And I just, it really helps just to sit down and talk person to person with someone and to use as many I statements as you can. I'm not sure I can solve all of Israel's issues or have strong feelings about what should be done or shouldn't be done in Israel, but I know that the fear in Black lives to let their children out, to let them have athletic events or to walk down the street without being shot is real. And I think we need to stop. I think we need to be able to talk. I understand things on a global level and all of that, but I just think that when the conversation goes to you and me, us and them, we build walls.
Yeah.
And most of us are a generation away from some sort of fascist form of oppression, whether we are children or grandchildren of the Holocaust or of pogroms or of some other violence to us. And I think if we lose connection to that and can't tell our stories, I think we lose our place at the table, our credibility, our ability to listen and be heard.
Okay, thank you.
Brenda, I think that's it's a great point. And I think, and when we talked about the civil rights movement, we talked about like Heschel and Martin Luther King, even though I said I don't like using that example, I think part of it is that it wasn't just about being political in that moment, right? It was about this shared experience and shared stories. And, even just thinking about how we relate to each other and how often I was talking to someone today who's on a board, does after school tutoring for students who are mostly minority, and said she was talking to one of the parents, and the parent said, every time my child goes out the door, I have to give them a talk about the police, right? That we don't live in that world, right? We certainly as Jews don't live in that world in America, right? There might have been other times in our history where we did. But that's very real. And hearing those stories and hearing people talk about their experiences. And I think that's part of what we're seeing in terms of this movement right now. Like we're seeing this, we're living in a very partisan world, but there's a lot of places of consensus on this on racial justice, even on criminal justice issues. And you have police departments saying, actually, like we need to do a better job in talking about our training programs, and we need to do a better job at our training programs. And we need to think about how we're sharing information between police departments so that someone who gets kicked off one police department doesn't end up down the street, because that's happened. And so I think we're starting to see the conversation change. And part of that is people are having these deeper conversations, like you spoke about.
It's a question from Marcia Stephanie. It says, I've heard that Black Lives Matter organization does have a national platform that is pro-BDS, anti-Israel. Did I understand you to say that they don't have that in their current charter? And I heard the same about the NAACP on the national level. Please clarify.
So Black Lives Matter does not. The Movement for Black Lives does. They're not the same organization. It is very confusing. So yes, the Movement for Black Lives, which up until recently, their website hadn't been updated since in the last 4 years. So it's how much of a strength that organization has, it seems to be limited. But yes, the Movement for Black Lives has a anti-Israel part of their platform, pro-DDS part of their platform. Black Lives Matter does not, and we have actually really went through the Black Lives Matter website and their social media to like make sure that I could equivocally say that. And it's Black Lives Matter does not have that position. And as I mentioned before, neither does the NAACP.
Okay, thank you. Jordan Stern, I'm trying to unmute you so you can finish your question.
I get his question. So even if you can unmute him,
Okay,
I can.
he's unmuted. He's unmuted. Okay.
So, the movie Selma, Jordan said the movie Selma doesn't show the support the Jews gave. And I think that, you know, I'm going to be honest, like when I first watched the movie Selma, I had a very similar reaction that we know that there were Jewish teenagers and Jewish college students, and we know that some 3, right, lost their lives in Mississippi and during the civil rights movement, and that were very involved in putting their lives on the line to register voters. And that wasn't shown in the movie Selma. And I think that, and it was interesting about, trying to think how many years ago, 14 years ago or 15 years ago, I was asked to speak on a panel about faith and politics. And I was frankly like the token Jew in Jackson, Mississippi, which was an experience unto itself. And so I spoke on my panel, which was a little bit weird, but maybe conversation for another day. And then they had a whole lunch program about summer in Mississippi. And they didn't really address Jewish involvement. So I asked a question and kind of pushed it in the program. But I think it kind of goes back to what Ken was talking about before, is that we also need to kind of place our history, but there are, you know, this is not necessarily, right? Like this isn't the moment to say, it could be part of the conversation, right? We were there before, but I think we need to focus, and I say the same thing when we talk about Israel and we talk about past peace agreements, is that we need to move forward, because we know in terms of advocacy, especially just in terms of like how millennials and Gen Xers, right, operate is a no one wants to hear like, okay, you did this 20 years ago or 40 years ago or 50 or 60 years ago. It's important, and we should talk about it, but that can't be the whole conversation. And so thinking about how do we move forward together, right? And we say this a lot with Israelis and Palestinians, how do we move forward together? How do we move forward in this peace? But I think we're in a similar situation here. How do we move the conversation forward? How do we move our alliances between Jewish and Black community forward today? And then once we have those relationships, to Brenda's point, then we can have these conversations about the movie Selma and where Jews were and why Jews weren't covered in some of these cinematic and other kind of historical tellings of events.
Thank you. Are there any further questions before Stephanie wraps up? Hi, Gabe. Let me unmute you. There you go. No, you're not. Kathleen, you'll have to. There you go.
Thank you. Before I forget, Brenda, I think you're spot on in what you said, and I appreciate you having said it. So Stephanie, my question is, I understand your national perspective, and I understand there are people addressing those questions. What would you recommend, or what should a small federation in London, Connecticut do to show support of our fellow Americans in these times?
So I think there could be a series of things, right? One is doing a mapping, what organizations, right? I think someone mentioned doing a program with the NAACP, mapping what organizations are in your community and thinking about what are the relationships like. And one community called me a few days ago and said, we had this situation and it was with a local leader. She's like, but I talk to him all the time. So we were able to diffuse the situation very quickly. And so thinking about what relationships the Jewish community already has, building upon those relationships, even if it's just calling and picking up the phone and saying, we know that right now is a really difficult time for you. We want you to know we're here for you. Right. And so let us know how we can be helpful or how we can move a conversation. And maybe it's having, right now we're all socially distant still in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, right? Maybe the rest of the country, not so much. But in trying to think about whether there's an online opportunity or something you can plan ahead, one of the things that many communities have been working on is voting rights, right? Just simply like making sure people are registered to vote. It's a priority and has been a priority of NAACP and of many groups. It's not an answer to everything, but it is a way to kind of engage. And so I would start with a couple of small steps, right? First, relationships, utilizing relationships you already have, then joint programs, and then maybe a joint initiative. And it could also be bringing in a speaker. Some communities have brought in Eric Ward, who is from the Western State Center, and he is amazing, and he speaks about racism, but he also speaks about anti-Semitism and how anti-Semitism is a linchpin for other hateful ideologies. And so thinking about that as a kind of a shared conversation. Those would be my first steps. And I see Ron, we have one more question.
Actually, one more question from Ron. Are you aware of any anti-Semitic actions and or chants during protests over the past few weeks? I've heard some troubling reports.
So we're aware of a couple, and we're also aware of one that got a lot of coverage that really wasn't what it was. So I'm going to explain that. I know it sounds very confusing. So in LA, there were a few news articles that in LA, the protests turned into an anti-Semitic effort, an anti-Semitic act. There was desecration to the outside of a synagogue. And there was a lot of conversation, I think, around that, being particularly that there was an article that said it was Palestinians running that part of the protest. We work very closely with the Secure Community Network, which works very closely with law enforcement. And so we immediately kind of checked in with the LA Federation and their community security director, and found that a lot of the allegations and talked to people who were there, and a lot of the allegations were false. And so we're trying to make sure that, and this is a struggle I think we often have, is making sure that one eyewitness account doesn't shape a whole narrative. And so we saw that in LA, that's what happened. There was an issue in the Berkshires. So it's somewhat close to you guys. So what happened at the Berkshires, it was 2 weeks ago on a Saturday afternoon, there was a Black Lives Matter rally. One of the speakers made a comment about Israel, and said he had gotten, and it's interesting because he had spoken to the Federation leadership kind of a little bit the day before, and there were lots of rabbis and community members in attendance. And he made a comment about how the police are learning this technique from Israel because he heard it from somewhere. We found out that he heard it from leaders of JBP. Since that time, there has been a lot of work and discussion with him and other leaders in the community. There's been some back and forth in the local newspaper. very quickly from Jewish community leaders. The ADL was also involved in talking about trying to really unpack what he was talking about, where he got his information from. But we haven't heard about any other protests or major events where speakers have made kind of anti-Semitic remarks. And we really haven't heard much in terms of chanting or other things like that. So we are on the lookout for them. I talked to Michael Masters, who's the head of SCAN, probably 6 to 8 times a day. Anytime one of us gets, and so I would also say, if you hear about something, right, like we want to engage in these efforts, but we also at the same time want to make sure that anti-Semitism doesn't become part of it. And so we are being very vigilant into any claim we hear, to really checking and find out what's going on, so that we can get involved as needed, whether it's from a security perspective or from a PR, public affairs perspective. And I will say that in Minneapolis, because the protests became violent, as we all know, or there were violent protests, I should say. They did take security measures with the synagogues and with the Torahs to make sure that there were no issues. There weren't, but it is something that we are very conscious of, and we are thinking about, and is part of how we look at these, look at all issues, really.
Thank you, Stephanie. Before we close, I want to remind everybody that Hadassah is hosting another conversation tomorrow night at 7 o'clock with Jean Jordan, who's the president of our local New London NAACP. And I know you've been receiving that information online as well. Stephanie Hausner, thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate you dropping in. We hope to have you back again soon. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I hope you received some valuable information, and thanks. Good night.